In the City of London, they're pulling out every stop for the BBC's big anniversary. The guest list for a huge banquet includes major figures in public life, from the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Mayor of London to dozens of BBC stars and executives. And the person standing up to toast the health of the BBC is none other than the Prime Minister.
How happy I am to be able to say that the relations between Number 10 and the BBC should be so good.
The playful ribbing at the BBC's 50th anniversary suggests it was assured and confident at the heart of the establishment.
I cannot help noticing how on every occasion in which the members of the BBC come to Number 10, how much they enjoy themselves.
It wasn't quite like that. Behind the scenes, it was often on the edge. Programme making was precarious and fraught with risk. Frequently a battle just to keep the show on the road.
The whole fleet is lit up. It's fairyland. The whole fleet is in fairyland. I'm sorry, I was telling some people to shut up talking.
What is it about a series like this which has come
and
back?
I hate you, I talk this to
Could I please... Look, we'll wrap this up in 60 seconds if I can't make a point without being heard.
For the time being... Excuse me. Yes?
What is the matter? I've never seen such disorder in any studio.
I'm up. I can't control myself at all.
Well, what's going to happen now, I'm not quite sure. And if I suddenly disappear, you'll know that it's a very successful icebreaker.
The pioneers developed broadcasting and shaped the BBC largely through trial and error, seizing opportunities and coping with accidents. From special interviews filmed for this project over the last 8 years, it's clear they often operated impulsively and under the radar.
You know, we'll jack of all trades, all seat-of-the-pants stuff.
They certainly wouldn't have been vetted upstairs.
I mean, that's how things were done in those days. You were totally left alone, absolutely.
Even the man at the top had to start from scratch.
I didn't know what broadcasting was.
For much of the BBC's life, it's been a process of sometimes glorious, sometimes painful discovery.
You are awful. But I like you.
First of all, I must apologize for my voice. Since my last talk, I've had the somewhat alarming experience, common to most broadcast actors, of hearing my own voice on the Blattnerphone. When I heard it on this curious instrument, I was frankly horrified. It struck me as being almost the most unpleasant voice
At the start, everything was new. The British Broadcasting Company began 5 years before there were talkies in the cinema. No wonder voices on the air were a thrill.
What people of my generation remember of the early days of broadcasting was the sheer excitement of it. And as a boy of 10, I could buy a crystal set. Indeed, I did at Woolworths, if I remember rightly, for sixpence. And the rest of the apparatus cost another sixpence, and earphones, of course, were extra.
This is 2LO calling. Now, tonight you're going to hear news and views of the theatre by the BBC dramatic critic, Mr. Archibald Haddon.
Hello, playgoers.
It meant a very tall pole in the garden, connected with a long wire to my bedroom windowsill, and then a black box, inside of which was a crystal and what was known as a cat's whisker, and you would twiddle the cat's whisker, and eventually you got a voice.
The principal points to remember are as follows. 1. You dance on the ball of your foot and not on your toes. 2.
What year do you think that would be?
Oh, goodness. Well, it was still at the house where I was born. It was possibly about 1924.
This is London calling. And here is Harry Graham, who's going to tell you something about his aunts.
And when you got it and you put the headphones on, the sound was absolutely clear. It was so clear. There was no interference, nothing. It was just pure sound.
And one of the excitements of those days was the prospect of being struck dead on the spot. If lightning hit your outdoor aerial.
Passes too hard and the ball's gone over the line about 30 yards from the Blackburn goal.
Still in square 4.
Here's a great chance. He's
Back
shot.
in 4 again.
Ross Kemp has bundled Mercer and the ball to the net. It's a goal to Blackburn Rovers in well under a minute. Jove, what a sensational start.
We were hearing just not voices, but we were hearing cows mooing, and we were hearing people singing lovely songs, wonderful music.
National program from London. We begin this evening with a concert by the Gershon Parkington Quintet, who will play Liebestraum, Love's Dream by Liszt.
The radio pioneers were fired up by a mission to educate and inform as well as entertain.
People said, this is good, we'd like more of this, because you see, nobody knew anything about music. You realise that. Who went to concerts? Who went to the opera in those days? Only the people who could afford it, the rich. The poor people, the ordinary people in the street, never heard of an opera in their lives, never heard a symphony concert. How should they? And then suddenly there it was in their ears. So this was opening up a new world to people. The general education of the world has been so changed by radio.
The fledgling BBC seized the opportunity to shape this previously inaccessible world. Only 5 years in, and now a public corporation, it took over the proms and then set up the first salaried orchestra in Britain, the BBC Symphony.
And this is the excitement that every time you were touching something which had never been touched before, and everybody's excitement and interest in life was lifted. People began to know about, about gardening that they'd never known before, about beekeeping, about agriculture, about whatever you like. They hadn't known. Now they began to know.
The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have liftoff.
4 decades later, the pioneer spirit was still very much alive. At Christmas 1968, people were gripped by the coverage of Apollo 8, the daring American mission to send a manned spacecraft round the back of the moon, 7 months before the first moon landing. The BBC carried it live, in a mixture of colour and black and white, but there was no guarantee of success.
This mission is loaded with what's called life-critical points. Those are the points during the mission when, if anything goes wrong, a rocket fires or fails to fire or misfires, then the life of the astronauts is put in danger.
We were in Alexandra Palace, Patrick Moore and I, and they went behind the moon. And the thing is, you go behind the moon, and for a period of time, you're out of radio contact.
During, and each time they go round, they pass through a 45-minute communications blackout with Earth. If anything goes wrong there, nobody knows back on Earth until they come out if anything's gone wrong. After those 10 orbits, they've got to fire this rocket again to take them back to Earth.
And if it fires wrongly, you re-emerge from behind the moon, or you crash into the moon, or you re-emerge heading off into space.
If that rocket continues to fail to fire, they'll stay there, and their oxygen will run out on February the 24th.
So everybody was very excited about what condition they were in as they came round into view again.
The essential moment came on Christmas Eve, with viewers and presenters on the edge of their seats.
No voice contact yet. We're standing by.
At 10:36 this morning, Apollo 8 went round the far side of the moon at just over 7,000 miles an hour into complete radio blackout.
And just before they were about to re-emerge, the lights suddenly went out in the studio, and a voice in my ear said, "You're off the air." It was kind of urgent to know whether they were coming back or not.
Jackanory, 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 Jackanory.
And Patrick and I said, what on earth is going on? They're due to reappear within a few minutes. And then the lights came back on again, and the voice said, "You're on the air."
Apollo Control, Houston, we're looking at engine data, and it looks good. Tank pressures look good. We have not talked yet with the crew, but we're standing by. We've got it. We've got it. Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit. There's a cheer in this room. This is Apollo Control, Houston, switching now to the voice of Jim Lovell. By 60.5. Good to hear your voice.
And this is the satellite picture that is now coming from Apollo 8, and there is the moon.
I'll give you Shiloh horizon. Roger. I'll shift to the rendezvous window. Roger, Bill.
And this is through the rendezvous window, so they're pointing straight at the moon.
Looks like we got a real good picture now.
Patrick Moore, what did you think of that?
Quite incredible. One thing we've got to bear in mind, I think, they were magnificent pictures. I'm not going to say they show us more detail than we've got from the orbiters, because they probably don't. But don't forget that people were actually seeing them direct for the first time.
And we finished that show and went to the control gallery and said, what happened? And the control gallery people said, we went off the air because we had to be on the air for Jackanory, and you were going to interrupt it. And we said, oh. And they said, and the phone rang almost immediately, and a voice said, this is the query to Her Majesty the Queen Mother, who says to tell you, quote, what do you think you're doing? And so we went back on the air, and there you were.
Gentlemen, all in all, an extraordinary and satisfying morning, would you say?
I think that's the understatement of the year, or in fact the understatement of any century.
The man who led the BBC pioneers in the 20s and set its course for the first 15 years was an imposing Scotsman, John Reith. His influence still guides the BBC today.
Of course, one was struck immediately by his great height, which I think is 6'7". I remember how impressed I was by this enormously tall giant, piercing eyes, and this awful wound on his face, where he was shot during the war. This great scar right across his cheeks here, red and deep. And I sort of felt, well, if you saw him on a dark night, you'd be rather frightened. But he had a friendly look. He didn't frighten me.
Reith was appointed general manager of the brand new BBC at the end of 1922. He and 4 colleagues were to set up a national radio service to absorb the tiny amateur outfits that had been springing up. Reith was an engineer by training from Stonehaven near Aberdeen.
I didn't know what broadcasting was.
How do you mean you didn't know what it was?
I literally didn't know what broadcasting was. The advertisement was attractive. I thought it was the sort of thing I wanted, and I applied.
Because I was after the job of director of programme, believe it or not. I knew as much about making a programme as a caterpillar, you know. Ridiculous.
Did you really have qualifications at that time for this job, do you think?
Oh. I had qualifications for managing, I thought, almost anything. Is that all right?
Fine, yes.
There it was suddenly upon us. And we had to take hold of this strange tiger, you know, and start pulling it by the tail to see what would happen.
From the start, they found it a struggle. Some vested interests saw broadcasting as a threat to their survival.
Of course, it created the most terrible difficulties. What were the sports people going to do for their audiences? They'd all be sitting at home. What were the parsons going to do for a congregation? Nobody would come, you see. Of course, it didn't work out like that at all, but that's what people thought. So we at once, for the first few days, ran into the most tremendous antagonism. No, you can't come and broadcast our cricket match. You can't come and broadcast our religious service. We won't let you into our theatre, you know. This was the attitude, and all this had to be overcome.
The more expensive wireless receivers were less risky than crystal sets. Valve radios with speakers made broadcasts a shared experience.
We had a wireless set, and it was the first one in the road, and people came around to listen to things from it.
What sort of wireless set was it?
A big box thing with a battery that had to be recharged at the local garage, and it was so heavy that only my father could take it there.
To the children, I would like to send a special message.
Always remember George V. Are you listening, children? This is the King speaking to you.
The King is speaking to you.
So I sat up straight.
Only 7 years in, the BBC began experimenting with television. And in November 1936, at the North London studios of Alexandra Palace, it launched what was called a regular high-definition television channel, the first such domestic service in the world. Test runs had culminated in a variety show devised by a radio producer, which was captured by cinema newsreels.
I thought, well, we must have a new song. So I got hold of Ronnie Hill, a review writer, and he immediately came up with the song, Here's Looking at You.
And now we're going to see and hear someone you know well, Miss Helen Mackay.
And I thought, by Jove, there's the title. That's just exactly what we're all thinking. And this got us away.
Here's looking at you from across the blue.
The test broadcast caught the imagination of a young radio critic. Grace Wyndham Goldie, who would go on to become one of television's principal pioneers, went to watch it, ignoring her editor's objections.
He said, look, very crossly, television is going to be of no importance in your lifetime or mine, and I don't want you wasting your time on it. Now, the production, of course, was terrible. Reception was awful. And I was convinced this was going to become one of the most important influences that had ever been created. Now, what is it that television can do that nothing else can? In my view, it's a very simple and obvious one, but it's worth reiterating. It can let you see things at a distance at the moment when they're happening. Now, this is peculiar to television. That is what makes television preeminent.
But back in 1936, there was no sign that Sir John Reith saw it that way.
Do you remember him taking any interest in television starting?
Did he?
Yes.
Not very much. No, the BBC didn't, you know. That was really one of the shortcomings. The senior people mistrusted television. They were so in love with sound radio that they didn't see the future.
He hated it. He once told me later on, since I've retired, talking about it, he said, you know, I was always afraid of television. Nobody can imagine that he was afraid of anything.
Reith was far more preoccupied with the developing constitutional crisis. As 1936 drew to a close, King Edward VIII looked likely to abdicate. Reith spotted an opportunity for the BBC to play a pivotal role.
I told our people to wire up the King's own personal premises in Windsor Castle. It came to the notice of the civil service. And I was rung. Said, "True you're wiring up at Windsor Castle?" I said, "Yes." "What for?" I said, "It's against anything that might happen." But it can't happen without our knowledge and approval." "No, I know. What about it?" Well, then, in due course, it was approved.
For the King's abdication broadcast, Reith decided that he himself should introduce him. No longer King, and not yet the Duke of Windsor. He was in close contact with the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, and Reith's go-between was his new 19-year-old secretary.
Because that was one of the most thrilling bits of my young life at that time. He dictated what he was going to say, which I typed, and then he said, "Now I want you to ring for a cab, and I want you to take this yourself to number 10 Downing Street and give it to Mr. Baldwin into his hand." And so I did that accordingly and found quite thrilling and stuck to my guns until I was taken into Mr. Baldwin's presence when I said, "This is from Sir John Reith," and then left.
Driving over to Windsor that night, I felt, here am I going to make an announcement on the wireless which is going to be listened to millions and millions of people all over the world. The most tremendous broadcast possibly that had ever been made by any country, the abdication of a monarch.
This is the marvellous thing about the BBC, of course, that it was at the centre of every crisis.
There was a table, and I said, "I will sit down on this chair if you will just stand beside me, sir." I said, "Well, immediately I have an answer. I will slip out to the left and you slip in to the right."
This is Windsor Castle. His Royal Highness Prince Edward.
In following me into the chair, he happened to give an awful kick to the table leg.
The newspapers said that John Reith was so disgusted with the King that he slammed the door when he went out, which was totally wrong, of course.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
John Reith kept a scrapbook because he was extremely vain, bless him. He loved anything in the newspapers about himself and about the BBC, and little photographs and things, you see, where he'd been. And he said, would you put them in my scrapbook? And so I stuck them all in just as I would when I had a scrapbook as a child, you know, the way it pleased me. And he was furious. After he said, look, did you not think of looking at the beginning of the book and seeing how it was done? You just found a new page and you put all this in. Couldn't you see this? And take them all out and pull them together and then put them all back in the proper way. So I went out of the room, went to the ladies' loo and burst into tears.
Reith revelled in being at the centre of a crisis, but his successors weren't always as sure-handed. Friday, November the 22nd, 1963 was a day when BBC television almost came off the rails. As shocking news began to emerge from Dallas in Texas, there was no template for handling such a fast-moving story. It was a matter of more or less making it up as they went along. Most of the key decision-makers at the studios in Lime Grove, Alexandra Palace and Television Centre were out of reach.
The week was winding down, and it was a night of the Television Awards, and a lot of people had gone to the Dorchester Hotel.
And so Robert Dougal and Kenneth Kendall and everybody concerned with the presentation of the television news were there.
So a few people left in Lime Grove. Tonight was going out.
Good evening.
When news came through of the assassination attempt on President Kennedy, Cliff gave that on the air, and then the programme closed down.
This is BBC Television.
The newsroom at Alexandra Palace was on alert as further reports came in.
John Roberts was reading the news that evening, a standby newsreader from New Zealand. A good chap, but not very used to the operation at all. A series of messages were handed in to him, little sheets of paper. The president had been shot at. The president had been removed to hospital.
In the scramble for information, the BBC had one major advantage. At Caversham near Reading, it had a listening service where round the clock staff monitored shortwave broadcasts from other countries.
Monitoring service. Yes, they're on the air.
This is the Voice of America broadcasting worldwide.
Then came a message from the Voice of America who announced that the president was dead.
President Kennedy is dead. The President of the United States was shot down by an assassin's bullet as he rode through...
Extra newsroom, please, urgent.
Normal practice was to hold back a news story until it had been corroborated by a second source.
Hold it, everybody in the studio, will you? Change coming up.
John White, who was the editor for the day, had to make the terrible decision of whether he would actually announce on the air for the BBC, which was meant to be the fount of absolute reliability, of course, that the president was dead. And he decided that if the Voice of America said so, then it must be true.
With little else to go on, BBC television was paralysed. For 19 minutes, it ran the station ident of a revolving globe, with 3 terse news flashes from the unfamiliar figure of John Roberts, who said, according to the Voice of America, President Kennedy is dead.
I remember reeling with shock, and there was a straightforward announcement, and they said, we'll be bringing you more later. And I went up to the au pair, where the au pair was bathing my daughter, and said, Kennedy's dead. And I remember her sort of collapsing on the chair. And I said, I think we both need a strong drink. And I went and poured 2 whiskies, and we were shaking. We were shaking with the shock of it.
Presentation certainly didn't know what to do next. I mean, they did the appalling thing, actually, eventually, after 15 minutes, of putting on a comedy programme with Harry Worth. I mean, it was one of the worst nights in the history of the BBC.
Latest news and pictures from America, over to the newsroom.
The death of John F. Kennedy happened in Dallas at 12:25. In our time, 6:25 this evening.
Gradually they began to improvise. It was effectively the BBC's first stuttering attempt at rolling news in those far-off days without the internet or mobile phones.
Hello,
Leonard?
Hello, yes?
Yes, OK, you can go ahead then.
Right-ho. Well, so long as you realise all I've got in front of me is a pile of tape, which I'm just ripping off the printer, with a phone ringing as well. Hello, London, this is Leonard Parkin, calling radio newsreel from Washington. President Kennedy...
She had entered the hospital cradling her husband's head and weeping. Reporters said she was not hysterical.
We have, I hope, the line open to Washington and to our correspondent there, Leonard Parkin. Leonard, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello.
What's going on in Washington now?
Well, obviously...
Getting pictures across the Atlantic was a laborious process. Satellite broadcasting was in its infancy, but only when the Telstar satellite was within range. That evening it wasn't.
His brother Robert, the U.S. Attorney General, was told in Washington. In America, there was an immediate sense of horror and shock. Flags at half-mast, the United Nations in grieved tribute as this first film shows, just received over the transatlantic cable.
If you filmed something in the United Nations, that was sent picture by telefilm, by cable under the Atlantic. Within an hour of sending picture by picture, you could have transmitted about 2 minutes of film.
2 or 3 minutes ago, over the link from America, we received some of the first pictures of the confusion, crisis and emergency that followed President Kennedy's shooting, an event that put everyone...
At the Alexandra Palace end, there was a similar machine, so they would take the film out of the machine, develop it, which they could do in about 10 minutes, and could be on the air within possibly 3 or 4 hours.
In the bottom of the car, President Kennedy was bleeding to death, supported by his wife as his special guard drove frenziedly to hospital. Behind them was turmoil. Ahead of them, within half an hour, were the last rites and the death of the president.
Programs tonight have been rearranged.
The newsroom didn't have the resources or capacity to run all evening, which left BBC executives scratching their heads.
My programme was about Benjamin Britten. It's his birthday, the 22nd of November, St. Cecilia's Day. So I went up and they were running this Harry Worth comedy still. I could see it on the screen. It was most surrealistic to have President Kennedy image one play and the comedy in another. And they said, well, what's in your programme? So I told them film of Aldborough and a bit of orchestra. And then we're going to finish with film from the war, Requiem. Requiem, they said? Perfect. Right, that show stays in.
His Benjamin Britten film gave the Panorama team time to get its act together for a late-night tribute to President Kennedy.
I suppose I was the most senior person around the place, and I decided that what was needed was a programme with the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and with Joe Grimman. Friday night, you try and find the politicians. Alec Hume, who was then the Prime Minister, was on his way to spend the weekend with the Duke of Norfolk, and was in the car speeding down to Arundel. And we got an AA man to stop the Prime Minister's car and tell him that it was important that he phoned Downing Street. No telephones in those days. He phoned Downing Street and was told the news and decided to go back to London to appear on television. He was in his country clothes. He felt that he couldn't appear like that on television. Went to Downing Street, changed in a suit, black tie, went to Broadcasting House and got stuck in the lift 10 minutes before the broadcast.
There are times in life when mind and heart stand still, and one such is now, and all of you will have felt, as I did, that everything in one cried out in protest.
Wilson, as the Leader of the Opposition, was in North Wales. He was the first one we actually managed to get hold of. And Wilson said, where do you want me? And we sent him to Manchester.
I was addressing a large meeting. And when it was announced, all the people in the hall let out an involuntary gasp of horror.
Joe Grimman was at the Oxford Union speaking there and got a hold of him and had to interrupt the debate. And I sent a car down to pick Joe up.
There will be quite ordinary people this evening who will feel this as a totally unexpected personal tragedy, as though one of their own relations had been killed.
I think it was a coup to get that night to get those three leading people together. They'd all had met Kennedy. They all spoke well of him. And it was a program of some significance.
A shot rang out like a sudden shout, and heaven held its breath, for the dreams of a multitude of men rode with him to his death. Lord rode with him to his death.
Within 24 hours, the cast of That Was the Week That Was switched from its normal satire to salute.
And that was amazing for that capacity to respond. People have said, oh, it looks a bit mawkish. I should think it would, but I mean, at the time, it was just exactly what people needed.
Suddenly, over there in Washington, was this amazing
They
man.
spoke from the heart. I doubt if their scripts were vetted. They certainly wouldn't have been vetted upstairs.
Behind the trappings of the image was the first Western politician to
Producers in those days were trusted to get the tone right, and that was very important. It was a sort of consolation of some kind.
The tragedy of John Kennedy's death is not that the liberal movements of history that he led will cease. It is that their focus may become blurred and that the gathering momentum may be lost. That is the aftermath of Dallas, November 22.
That Saturday, the world felt unstable and out of control. If the audience was worried and frightened, the first episode of a new children's serial going out the same evening was hardly likely to calm nerves.
That night was a significant night because it was when Kennedy was killed. I first heard about it when I was going to an awards ceremony, and I was in a state of shock, and I thought, what's this going to do to us? I thought it would be cancelled, but it wasn't. And I didn't quite know how the whole thing would be received. I mean, let's face it, here was a program for children initially, competing with the biggest news story in the world.
There's only one way in and out of this yard. I should be here when you get back. I want to see your faces when you try to explain away your behavior to a policeman. Nevertheless, we're going to find one. Come on, Barbara.
What's he doing out there?
She is in there! Close the door, please! Barbara, what do you like?
Waris Hussein was a 26-year-old Cambridge graduate and the only Asian drama director in television. The BBC had gambled on him after the original director pulled out.
The first director thought it was a load of rubbish and walked off it. And in dudgeon, he said, I'm not going to work on this shit, and left. So they had no choice. They had a program scheduled, but they had no director. So what did they do? They looked around and saw this eager young Indian hanging around waiting for a job offer.
Doctor Who was the brainchild of Sidney Newman, the Canadian who'd been brought in to take risks and shake up BBC drama, which he regarded as absolutely asleep.
The idea of Doctor Who was, it was basically a senile old man of 720 years or 60 years of age who had escaped from a distant planet in a spaceship. And the spaceship had the capacity to go forward and backward in time.
And he wanted radical thinking. And Doctor Who in some ways was, if you think about it. Who else could come up with a telephone box that hummed, and if you opened the doors, enter a vast space which turns out to be a spaceship? That takes imagination.
Newman hired a young woman producer to work with Hussein, Verity Lambert.
I used to say to her in a jokey way, Sidney, you and I are the Three Musketeers. We were all outsiders. And I think that was important. The very first script was about a quest for fire among prehistoric people. Actors had to wear flea-bitten skins as costumes and speak in strange dialogue.
When will Tsar make fire come from his hands?
When Orb decides it.
Orb is for strong men.
I said, Verity, what are we going to do with all this? She said, we're going to have it to make it work.
The creature has opened his eye.
I said, but we can't be laughed at. I was terrified of being laughed at. And this, going along with my background, as you can imagine, was something to be dealt with.
And one absolute rule I laid down was there'd be no bug-eyed monsters. None of these creepy, crawly things from outer space, the usual nonsense of science fiction stuff. And then she came out with this Dalek business, and I was livid with anger.
Verity said, "You're going to have to put up with bug-eyed monsters, Sidney, if you like it or not," because they'd already written them in, you see.
She said, "But honest, Sidney, they are not bug-eyed monsters. They were once living creatures with brains, and their brains had become so large, their bodies had atrophied, and they needed the metal casing to support the brain."
You will move ahead of us and follow my directions. This way.
There is the wisdom of being a great head of drama group. I didn't want any bug-eyed monsters, and it was the Daleks that really made Doctor Who.
Britain had moved on since Reith's departure from Broadcasting House in 1938. So had the BBC. It was in a more challenging mood.
You're married, aren't you? That's why you can't take me home.
How'd you guess?
You're sort of soft. Marriage makes men softer.
When I saw you sitting there, I began to sizzle.
The weekly Wednesday play embraced 1960s culture, with escapist fantasy replaced by contemporary reality.
You're a lovely girl. Lovely.
My own attitude was a very liberal one about matters of sex. And the first play was at Nell Dunn's Up the Junction, which had the abortion scene of the girl who had become pregnant out of wedlock. And that caused a great furor.
Yorkie, are you a communist?
Well, who do you think that is, then? Winston Churchill?
It was a high-risk strategy for an audience used to prim classic drama. But Newman had the unwavering support of his boss, the 7th Director General, Hugh Carlton Green.
Yorkie!
When Hugh Green arrived and threw open the windows from the 3rd floor of Broadcasting House, the BBC had entered its modern age.
He was the brother of the novelist Graham Greene, and his influence in and beyond the BBC was as great as that of Reith. Both were fearless giants, but Greene was very different from his Presbyterian predecessor.
In those days, the job wasn't advertised. There was no candidature. He went to see Sir Arthur Ford, who was then the chairman of the BBC, at home. And Hugh was only asked one question by Arthur Ford. He said, "Are you a Catholic like your brother?"
I told him that Graham was a convert. I had been brought up a member of the Church of England, and I would describe my position as being that of a respectful agnostic.
He said, "Well, in that case, the job is yours."
But it's always struck me as odd that the BBC in a supposedly Christian country should prefer an agnostic as Director General to a Roman Catholic.
You called him DG, very clearly. You didn't call him Hugh or anything, or Sir Huw. It was DG. DG this, DG that, blah, blah, blah.
When he came into the Board of Management, the Board of Management stood up.
And he towered, I mean, I'm quite tall, but he towered over me.
A real glint in his eyes. I mean, he enjoyed life.
But he could be as tough as nails.
He didn't fit the bill then, as a Director General should look, let's say. Well, not as they used to look, I better say.
He enjoyed putting a pin into a bit of pomposity when he had a chance to do so.
Well, he looked rather goofy, actually, didn't he? You know, slightly prominent front teeth. He was always untidy. He always had this long coat, which was too long, and the hem was always coming down, dragging at the side. And he'd always got a button off on the thing, and I used to think, I wasn't really like that, but, you know, I used to feel, you know, that's not the way to be, you know. What's Mrs. Green doing? Why don't she sew the button on? And he didn't care, he didn't mind. And I think on reflection, I just wonder if that wasn't a bit deliberate.
I think he had a somewhat deceptive reputation, which he encouraged, which was that he was beholden to no man, and the BBC was a very independent body and he would not brook anybody interfering. It wasn't quite true. I mean, he was a very, very political animal. And while he suited his public reputation to say that he wasn't paying any regard to the politicians of the time, he knew when he had to.
That was the week that was. It's over, let it go. We're pleased to write it off, but not as pleased as one or two prime ministers we know.
Under Green, the satirical show That Was the Week That Was groundbreakingly provocative each Saturday night.
Macmillan's been reading Lord Denning in bed. He'd have found it much livelier with a trollop instead.
The Profumo scandal consuming the Macmillan government was grist to its mill.
Let no one judge her too harshly. She was only 21.
Let no one judge her too harshly. She is only 36, 23, 36.
I saw the pilots that the BBC had made before they transmitted that series, and it was so amazing that I actually put off my wedding date so that I could do the first 6 of those shows.
Ned Sharon had access directly to the Director General. Now, for an executive producer to have access to the Director General on a Saturday morning was quite something. But that was Huw Green. That was the week lived under his patronage.
Do you come here often?
Only in the mating season.
On Monday, Mr. Ernest Marples answered questions on the subject of the Channel Tunnel.
This was originally mooted in the days of Napoleon. Now we're in the days of Marples, and we still haven't got a firm decision.
Well, Napoleon was before my time, and there wasn't even a Tory government then.
He's wrong, of course. It was a Tory government, and the Prime Minister was Addington.
It was awfully clever, and really when you think of it, Millicent Martin, lovely Cockney, pretty, awfully nice girl, with Levin. I mean, Levin, the intellectual, you see what I mean? But it seemed to gel.
Whatever your intentions, whatever the bill's intentions, has in fact encouraged and stimulated colour prejudice in this country.
I don't agree. I don't think there is a colour prejudice in
What
this
about
country.
the chance?
I think this is the most tolerant country in regard to racial relations.
But your act
in
is
the
making
world.
it less so, and so are people like you.
I don't think so.
Everybody was absolutely appalled, rocking backwards in amazement that such stuff could be put on air.
It's a very unworthy accusation to make.
Your attitude is unworthy, Mr. Panel.
Oh, you think so?
I do indeed.
Especially from the BBC, so straight-laced.
Thank God we're Englishmen and not common market scum.
For why should we be pally with the wogs who started Calais?
Oh, de Gaulle may be 10 feet tall and think he's Napoleon.
But the French wash every 3 days, on B-days.
The Heron folk are a standing joke with their shorts and hairy knees.
And the poor old Dutch do nothing much but smell very faintly of cheese.
An Italian beau always says hello with a squeeze of finger and thumb.
Thank you.
So,
Thank God we're Englishmen and not common market, not common market, not common market scum.
We got all the flack in the office for it, and trying to justify this sketch and that sketch, and you used to view it and everything and think, oh, crikey, that'll do, Sensi, we'll get so-and-so on this.
For all his delight in puncturing pomposity, Huw Green knew how to retreat when he felt the political heat was too intense.
When push came to shove, he decided that the moment had come to stop.
I think it was almost craven of him to close it down only after 2 seasons. It was such a shame.
Oof, I don't think any of us could have continued much longer with TW3. The strain was really too much.
He was more... Devious is an unpleasant word, loaded, but I mean he was more scheming and sensitive and clever at maintaining the BBC's position, piloting away through the rapids.
Green knew he still had to honour the BBC's role as national broadcaster. After all, he joined it early in the Second World War, when with the infant television service in hibernation, all ears relied on the wireless for authority and reassurance.
You can imagine what a bitter blow it is to me
that all my long struggle to win peace has failed.
My father called us in. We were playing, and he said, "Come in, there's something very serious and important that the Prime Minister is going to say."
There is no chance of expecting that this man will ever give up his practice of using force to gain his will. He can only be stopped by force.
I sat down on the stairs and listened to it. I can remember it. I remember thinking, all my boyfriends are going to have to go.
He said, "We're at war with Germany." And my father, who had survived the First World War, said, "About time to."
I turned and saw my father crying, with tears down his cheeks, and he was not a demonstrative man, and I'd never seen my father cry before in my life.
It is evil things that we shall be fighting against. Brute force, bad faith, injustice, oppression, and persecution. And against them I am certain that the right will prevail.
The BBC felt its wartime role was to strengthen civilian morale.
We always used to listen to Joby Priestley.
Dunkirk is another English epic.
It was the 9 o'clock news, and then we had the postscript.
And to my mind, what was most characteristically English about it, so typical of us, so absurd and yet so grand and gallant, that you hardly know whether to laugh or to cry when you read about them, was the part played in the difficult and dangerous embarkation, not by the warships, magnificent though they were, but by the little pleasure steamers.
Priestley talked about the little boats, the little ships that had gone out and brought everybody back. Now, we wouldn't have known about that if you just listened to the news.
I was his studio manager on many occasions. Sometimes I had to say, "Oh, Mr. Priestley, I hope you wouldn't mind, but..." And he'd look at me and say, "What is it now, laddie? What is it now?"
And somehow the way he said it, his manner, it was sort of reassuring, and you felt you knew what was going on.
And our great-grandchildren, when they learn how we began this war by snatching glory out of defeat and then swept on to victory, may also learn how the little holiday steamers made an excursion to hell and came back glorious.
I'm looking round now. I can hear machine gun fire, but I can't see our Spitfires. There must be somewhere there. Oh, here's one coming down now. There's one coming down in flames. Somebody's hit a German, and he's coming down. There's a long streak. He's coming down completely out of control, a long streak of smoke. The man's bailed out by parachute. The pilot's bailed out by parachute. He's a Junkers 87, and he's going slap into the sea, and there he goes, smash!
And the BBC had its great time during the war, and its link with the public unquestionably still dates back to what the BBC did during the war, what the BBC war correspondents did during the war.
Broadcasting House took some bomb damage, but it didn't interrupt its morale-boosting work.
Hello, folks. This is Tommy Handley.
Can I do you now, sir?
I became the spot effects boy for Itmar. It's that man again. Spot effects were effects you did on the spot. In the studio, rattle, rattle of a handle, open a door. Mrs. Mop, "Can I do you now, sir?" After Tommy Handley had said to Mrs. Mop, "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Mop, as soon as possible." "DSYG, what's that, sir?" "Don't show your garters." Slam of door. I was doing the door and the slamming, and I had to be so careful that I didn't laugh.
And then there was Sandy McPherson at the organ, and he was on for hours. Very patriotic chap.
And I do recall one journalist wrote in the paper after the bomber dropped to the BBC, they said, for goodness sake, why didn't they do it while Sandy McPherson was playing the organ?
Here is the Midnight News, and this is Alvar Liddell reading it.
It held the nation together during the war. And I can remember feeling that as a child. Yes, we are going to win.
And Alvar Liddell went to the extraordinary extent of saying, here is the news, and damn good news it is too.
Today was the most costly for the German airport.
The BBC was the monarchy, it was the country, it was the purpose, and it was speaking to us.
It was God's word.
A raid was launched in the early hours of today on the Dieppe area of enemy-occupied France.
God's word had its limits. Sometimes the need to be reassuring trumped accuracy.
The operation is still in progress, but reports say that all objectives were achieved.
It gave us an uncensored, or so we thought, uncensored picture of how the war was going. And one believed what the BBC was saying about the war was correct.
Oh, I think so. Whether they were or not, I don't know, but we believed them implicitly.
Nobody suggested that the BBC was distorting the truth in any way. Of course they were, a bit.
It's only many years afterwards that one found that there was censorship and that stuff was kept under wraps and that we weren't told everything that was going on.
It eventually became clear that the Dieppe raid had been a costly failure and the bullish on-the-spot report of Frank Gillard misleading.
Wave after wave of our fighters and bombers came out, received their orders from the headquarters ship, and then went in to support the men on the land. We could see them strafing the coastal defences, destroying communications and making low-level attacks on the enemy.
Bodies were being washed back towards us. We hauled wounded men out of the water and rescued them, pulled them up onto our craft. You know, my uniform was stained with the blood of other people, caked with it. We never truly got ashore at Dieppe. We took over 5,000 men that morning, and late that afternoon we returned with only 1,250. We left the remainder behind us, killed, wounded, or prisoners of war, and 1,000 of them were killed, and the sea ran red with blood.
As a combined operation, this raid was an all-time model.
The Canadian commander who planned the operation said at the end of the day, "I'm afraid this will go down in history as one of the greatest military disasters of all time," and he was absolutely right. The report that one was allowed to go on the air with, you know, concerned almost entirely the air action that was going on above our heads the whole time. And that was the only thing I could talk about, really. Everything else was heavily, heavily censored. And that is why I feel ashamed now, when I think back to the event, that I was not able to tell the true story of Dieppe to people. And I read in BBC literature about my memorable report from Dieppe. To me, it's memorable in all the wrong ways. It's memorable with shame and disgrace that I was there as the BBC's one and only eyewitness, and I couldn't tell that story as I ought to have told it.
A cast iron ball of 3 pounds weight, fired from open sights. This is round shot. This is what it does.
20 years later, in peacetime, grim battlefield reality was the watchword for an experimental drama documentary.
Alistair McInnes, age 20, right leg severed below knee joint.
In recreating the 18th century Battle of Culloden, the young director Peter Watkins set out to show the truth. And it hurt.
Malcolm Angus Chisholm, age 24, disemboweled. Ian MacDonald, age 13, shot.
He achieved a different level of reality by using amateurs rather than recognised actors.
He wanted to have people being tired and so on. He'd made all these chefs walk 23 miles, lawyers and schoolmasters and God knows what from Inverness. And of course they were clapped out. And it isn't surprising they looked tired. He wanted the uniforms to look as if they were used. And so they were all hired from great wardrobes, but he, with his own hands, split these things, put knives through them. There was something absolutely enchanting about this. I mean, he really did it right. He was a boy and a half.
Watkins then moved on to the war game. With similar techniques, he showed what might happen in Britain after a nuclear attack. The BBC decided initially to run with it.
It was because he had shown such talent that he was given a great deal of rope in making this programme, even though one knew that it was going to be very questionable whether in the end one could show it.
The government, Harold Wilson, was in power, and he had a majority of 2. And so it was a political hot potato for the BBC to make a programme suggesting that CND, some kind of pacifist position, was the right position to be in. press, brilliantly made. But what stuck in my gullet, in the aftermath part of the story, there was a sequence in which he'd got hundreds of people lying down along pavements in Rochester, brilliantly filmed. The ones who were dying constituted a terrible nuisance, putting it in the most nasty way, because you couldn't handle them. And there was chaos in the aftermath, you see. And then a policeman was taking a loaded pistol out, and then he was shooting, killing the dying. Now, I accepted that you would have to do something about that abominable problem, but I simply did not believe that anybody would get policemen to do it. Because if society is in a nightmare state of chaos, what you must have is confidence in such order and authority as remains. And I was sure if that was going to be done, they'd have got doctors or nurses or even nuns, so to speak, anything other than the police. And this was, as it were, an anti-police statement. And Watkins went through the roof and said that this was censorship and so on. There was an enormous row and he refused, point blank.
Wheldon referred it up to the Director General Sir Huw Green, who'd already broken with precedent by asking for advice from his new non-executive chairman, Lord Norman Brooke, recently Secretary to the Cabinet. He then broke with precedent himself by inviting some of his old Whitehall colleagues to Television Centre to watch a preview of the film, thereby compromising the BBC's independence.
The Defence Ministry felt that the government would be revealed as having taken quite inadequate precautions against the possibility of this kind of attack.
What Wheldon and Watkins didn't know was that 10 years earlier the BBC had reached a secret agreement with the Churchill government. The civil servant who'd brokered that agreement was Norman Brooke as Cabinet Secretary. So it wasn't a surprise that shortly before transmission the BBC pulled The War Game from the schedules.
The decision was not made against my wish. In fact, I think that I was more shocked by the programme than Norman Brooke was. And the basis for the decision was not a political one. It was because I could not face the responsibility of putting on the air a programme which was so shocking that old people living alone, for instance, or people who were somewhat disordered, might be so much upset by it that they could go out of their flat and throw themselves under a bus.
This previously unbroadcast interview suggests there was effectively an unprecedented veto by the Labour government, as was its right under the BBC's licence and agreement.
Frank Soskis, who was the Home Secretary, ordered me to ban the programme from being broadcast by the BBC. Now, I was only his master's voice. I had nothing to do with it, but Soskis was responsible for civil defence, and it was argued that this would lead to panic. And so I had to send a directive saying you must not broadcast it.
The BBC's overriding duty really ought to have been to broadcast it come hell or high water as a duty to the public. I simply thought that it was a slice of truth which ought to have been televised.
And when you remember all that was said about the Russians jamming the BBC, the British government jammed the BBC on the war game. We censored our own organisation.
And with that, we end our programme for tonight. Now we bid you good night, and the next tonight will be tomorrow night. Good night.
Much of the maverick spirit of the 50s and 60s emanated from Lime Grove Studios.
Willie Cave, you're my best friend, you are. 1 minute, you said at the last. 4 minutes, he goes.
This haphazard outpost in Shepherd's Bush, the old Gaumont Film Studios and some terraced houses, was conveniently far from headquarters at Broadcasting House.
Lime Grove was, in many ways, disgusting.
I loved Lime Grove. It was where I first sort of got bitten by the television bug.
It was a real slum.
There weren't any limes that I can remember, and it wasn't Grove-like at all. They were shabby little Victorian cottages, most of them.
With one lavatory and one bathroom. And there were some people sitting in the bathroom, and that was their office.
All our offices had basins and mirrors because they'd been star dressing rooms before the war, I think.
If there was a building more
perfectly designed to create an atmosphere of paranoid rivalry, not all of which was bad. It was Lime Grove.
Nobody ever told another person what they were doing, or if they did, they misled them.
Little revolutionary groups, really. I mean, sitting in what was the converted kitchen of a small cottage.
And not converted terribly well. They'd got a ground floor corridor with some wood-panelled rooms, but the rest was just a network of tiny rooms, and the access to the studio was down the fire escape.
Nobody who worked there ever knew where everything was. Everybody was always lost. Do you know where Panorama is? No, I think it's down there. It's up those stairs. Or maybe they're down there. Where's the cutting room? I think it's over there.
And I remember some very illustrious figure from an American channel, a really important American channel, enormously beautifully groomed and suited and so on, and taking him up this fire escape to the studio, and he said, Is this the BBC? Is this the BBC?
You know, the sort of modern thing where you show all the pipes and things. It wasn't showing the pipes, it was just the pipes were there. Everywhere were pipes.
But you met everybody in the place. And I remember very clearly walking along the corridor in Lime Grove one evening, and there was Orson Welles coming towards me. And Orson was, pretty big, and his shoulders sort of touched the wall. That's how narrow the place was. And hopping behind him came Huw Wheldon.
Duncan Sands, who had a gammy leg, arrived half an hour early, and I had no idea what to do with him. So I took him to my office, which was yet a gammy leg. It was upstairs, downstairs, roundabout. And I was reprimanded for bringing this cabinet into my office because it was a back kitchen.
I got stuck in the lift once with President Kenyatta of Kenya and Marshal Ayub Khan of Pakistan, stuck in the lift together. Have you met,
Producers, Sharon, Baverstock, Peacock, Wheldon, were totally in command. And in a way, the management of the BBC had no way of getting at them.
Which was why they hated Lime Grove, because it was seen as an empire, and it was doing the most powerful broadcasting.
It was just the place for the first television address by a British Prime Minister. That was in August 1956, after Egypt had nationalised the Suez Canal, and Sir Anthony Eden had already become friendly with a Lime Grove producer.
A young David Attenborough, who was then not the sort of national treasure that he is now. David was then a producer in Talks Department, and he was assigned by Leonard Mile to become the producer for Eden's broadcast, and got to know Eden so well he used to play tennis with Eden.
Off we went to Chequers. And after tea, Anthony said, would like a game of tennis at all? I said, yes, how kind, sir, thank you very much. Right, well, just go and get changed. So I went upstairs, and my bag, I thought was in my room, the bag was empty, and there was no tennis gear. And I got nothing to change into it. Where it had gone, I had no idea. And while I was worrying about this, I was hearing the bong and ping, and I looked out, and there was the Prime Minister playing tennis. Practising his serve in a very professional way. And I was standing in my underpants, desperately wondering what I was going to do. And so I opened the door and looked out and said, hello, anyone? And Philip de Zureta, his parliamentary private secretary, stuck his head out and said, is there a problem? I said, yes, I haven't got any gear. And he said, oh, well, they've probably taken it away to press it or something, because it may have been newly ironed or something, but I've got gear, so borrow mine. So I said, thank you so much. Bing, I hurriedly put it on. And of course, Philip was actually a tall chap, but also pretty, he won't mind me saying so, stout. So I had these floppy clothes on. Barely had to walk almost with my legs apart to keep the trousers from falling down. Not surprisingly, I decided tactfully that it would be better if the Prime Minister won most of those games, which wasn't difficult at all.
Eden was a terrible broadcaster. I mean, he had no idea how to do the thing. Now, the BBC didn't treat him very well. He came to Lime Grove. He was given the smallest studio possible, the presentation studio.
It was the beginning of politicians as celebs, really. There was a small crowd had gathered. How they knew he was coming, I don't know, but they did. And people were offering him pieces of paper to sign. I thought this was dreadful. You know, this is a serious political statesman, and you asking for their signature. But Eden was not in the least abashed. Collected them, I would sign them afterwards, you see. So the head commissionaire in Lime Grove, man called Mr. Stacey gathered all these things up. And Eden did his broadcast.
The Right Honourable Sir Anthony Eden, KG, MC, MP.
Good evening. The Suez Canal is a name familiar to everyone. I've come to talk to you tonight about what's happened there in the last few days and what it means to us.
The lights was very, very hot, and it really, really disturbed him. And he was really cross afterwards. He said that I'll never go there again because, you know, they were awful.
And we then after went down to the hospitality room and had a few drinks and one thing and another, and I told him how wonderful it was and so on. And then he left. But just before he was leaving, he said, what happened to those papers, of signature? I'll sign them now. So I fished them out, and I gave them to him, and he signed Anthony Eden C. And I came to one that was really just a scrumpled hotel bill, as far as I could see, with a bit of jam on it. And I thought, I am not going to give the Prime Minister of this country a piece of paper like that and ask for his signature. So I dropped it behind the sideboard. And Eden pushed off, and everybody, there was the crowd, and he went out and waved and got and drove away. And we went back to the hospitality room, as is the way as these things, in order to see whether there were any dregs left in any of the drinks, in order that we could actually relax after our part of the proceedings. When there was a knock on the door, and Mr. Stacey came in, he said, "Excuse me, sir, but we've got a bit of a problem. A gentleman outside said he sent in a piece of paper, which is a hotel bill, and he hasn't come out, and he needs to have it because he doesn't know the name of his hotel and he doesn't know where he's staying." See? So I don't know where it is. And I went on and grovelled on the floor and found out this filthy piece of paper, and gave it to Mr. Stacey, and Stacey said, "It's not signed, sir." And I said, "No." He said, "Oh, well, righto." So he got out a pencil, he went, "Sir Anthony Eden." He said, "I'll be all right." Off he went.
Prime Ministers could see that television was now the dominant medium, but at Broadcasting House, radio remained on its throne. Even there, under the noses of management, a Lime Grove-style individualism took hold. Producers seized their opportunities.
And I got on with this chap, and of course I come to have this baby, which, you know, I didn't want, and I was working at the time, and he was a married man.
I was working on a programme that nobody ever noticed, and that was an advantage in that we could get away with more or less anything, and I think on the whole we did.
Can you just describe it to me? Well, she inserts the syringe inside of you, and there's like an end on the syringe where you squeeze, you know, and she squeezes this. And of course, the other end of the syringe has to be actually in your womb, apparently.
Woman's Hour was, in fact, one of the most pioneering programmes of the age, because it tackled all sorts of subjects that couldn't be done on the evening programmes, which were being much more carefully monitored.
I was banging my head against the wall at the finish with pain. It was terrible.
I mean, we were just little women. Let them get on with it. It was a male-dominated organisation, in spite of the fact that there were some very successful women and some very talented women, but they were regarded in a slightly different light, and I was well aware of that.
From the start, John Reith had appointed key women to head departments.
He was absolutely blind as far as gender was concerned in promotion of women to jobs.
If you look back at the history of sound radio, you'll find extremely influential women at the very top of BBC Radio.
Hilda Matheson was the BBC's first director of talks in 1927 and went on to found the Week in Westminster programme on the Home Service. Mary Somerville was in charge of schools broadcasting and was later promoted to a controller. Mary Adams joined as adult education officer and became the first woman producer in television.
One thing I think that television has already done, particularly in schools programmes, is to educate the child in feelings. Right. After all, this is a different emphasis, and I believe that television can do that extremely well.
As head of talks, she brought David Attenborough into the BBC.
She knew everybody, you know, and she hardly ever spoke about people with their surnames, so that you had to guess. I mean, Mary would ring you up and say, "David, come, I want a word." And I would go up and she'd say, "Julian suggests that we should do such and such." And you had to know that that was Julian Huxley, the most distinguished biologist of the time.
The BBC had always been an equal opportunities organisation, and this meant equal pay. And there were some very enlightened people, both men and women, in the BBC's early and growing days.
But after the war, it became harder for young women to join production or technical departments.
Men had come back from the war and had to be found jobs, and they were preferred to the women on the whole.
The idea was that you should be unobtrusive. You didn't flounce about.
Some people were interviewed for general traineeship. My friend Claire Tomlin received a standard letter that women were not eligible for that particular role, so her application couldn't go forward. She subsequently became one of the greatest biographers of our day. And what is interesting is she accepted that. We all accepted that. We went, oh yes, of course, it's not for women. Women don't do management.
When I joined the BBC in 1960 as a general trainee, there were 12 of us. That was the first time that a BBC general trainee was a woman. She was a scientist, first time they had a scientist. That was also the first time that a trainee didn't come from Oxbridge. So that's the 1960s.
Yes, all right then.
On screen, professional women were given pride of place in a new twice-weekly soap opera, Compact.
That's right, thank you.
Unlike Coronation Street, which began on ITV a year earlier, this was a predominantly middle-class serial, set in a fashion magazine which was edited by a woman.
No. The weekly cliffhanger is terribly important for circulation figures.
I'd say to the leading lady, "I'd like you to walk from your desk to the filing cabinet," and that would give me some sort of camera movement. And camera movement was something that I was very keen on because I watched films. It was so funny. "Oh," she said, "I would never go to the filing cabinet myself," she said. "I'd get my assistant to do it."
But Mark, remember, it is only a stopgap. You'd better go on looking for that serial, hadn't you?
I don't know whether they wanted it to be something that was groundbreaking. To be honest, it fell into the trap of romantic love stories. And the girls were always young and attractive, and the men were sort of square-jawed and interesting. But the cliches were there, so anything that was breakthrough about having a female editor was not really considered in any serious way.
He's sending his accountant round tomorrow to explain things.
What the hell does that mean? Didn't you drop any hints?
No, but I get the impression it can only mean one thing. Trouble.
The paramount female editor behind the scenes in television was that young columnist who'd first seen its potential before the war. She was denied the top job in talks and current affairs until just before she retired. But nonetheless, she ruled the roost.
Here's looking at you from across the...
Grace Wyndham Goldie was a brilliant, fearsome, terrifying force.
She was always impeccably dressed.
Usually wearing a suit, quite often had a hat on.
Bird-like, but rather more like an eagle than a robin.
Very bossy.
Well, she looked as if she'd perhaps been opening a local bazaar or something.
She was a woman of iron whim.
She treated people appallingly, particularly the women. I mean, her secretary was the most downtrodden person on earth.
When you're talking about suffering fools, she didn't suffer fools at all.
She did listen to Hugh Green, but that was the only man she bothered about.
I was very scared of her. She didn't like me either.
She wanted political interviewing to be serious. She was passionate about it.
She said, I have a thought in my bath, and in 2 weeks it's a national institution. But that was actually true.
Q. Now, here outside the Southampton Guild Hall, we are waiting for the results of 2 constituencies, Test and Itchen.
One of Goldie's innovations was to turn general election results into a TV event.
Feeling now at the results.
Ready. We've interrupted because we've just heard Billericay's won the race. We'll go straight there now for the first result.
Here is the result. Here is the result. Edward Lucas Gardner, 29,000...
With Richard Dimbleby in the chair all through the night, more results were declared in the small hours, rather than being held over to the next day. All thanks to Goldie.
Well, it's the biggest ever yet as far as election results are concerned. On this occasion, we're using 57 television cameras, and as we feel that this is a service to the public, we shouldn't stop just when we fancy it, but we should go on giving them the results up while they're still coming out.
And there was a very striking Liberal vote, 16.2%. To interrupt you, the results ready in Exeter. Let's go down to the Queen of the West.
One live programme dreamt up by Goldie was historic. The concept even today would be ambitious and daring. But in 1954, with often fragile communications, it was an opportunity ripe for an accident.
On the occasion of the 80th birthday of the Right Honourable Sir Winston Churchill, Knight of the Most Noble Order of the Garter, Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury, Member of the Order
She
of
did
Merit...
get Churchill on the air for his 80th birthday programme. Churchill had never been on television before. Grace decided it must do something.
She came up with this very bright idea that she would collect about 14 of Churchill's intimates into a studio in Lime Grove in Shepherd's Bush, and she would ask them to address Churchill by way of the camera. So there was a camera in front of them, like there is in front of me now, and they would be asked to talk to this camera.
First General Lord Ismay.
Good evening, Prime Minister. I'm so proud to be the first to speak tonight.
Now, Churchill was asked to be in Downing Street.
As having been the head of your military staff throughout the war years.
And the theory was that he would look at this programme and he would be in a chair in Downing Street with a television set in front of him looking at it.
And now over to the other side of the world, Australia. Here is one who was Prime Minister of his country when the war broke out, Bob Menzies, now Prime Minister of Australia again.
Although the great majority of Australians have never seen you, you are something very close and intimate in our lives.
I wonder if you know, sir, how much you're loved and venerated throughout Europe. Here is a great European, Monsieur Spark of Belgium.
Dear Sir Winston, the image brought to you this evening is the expression of thankfulness of a world that would have died but for you.
Some of the tributes had been collected on film and some were live.
Well, God bless you, sir.
Grace Wyndham Goldie had sent one of her producers, Huw Wheldon, on ahead to brief Churchill about his live contribution.
I'd never seen Churchill, never. And so I went down to Downing Street for this event, and everything was okay there. The camera was there, ready for him to talk to if he wanted to when they'd finished. The television set was there. We had to put one in, by the way. There wasn't a television set in Downing Street.
It was a happy chance, sir, that the Prime Minister of Ceylon has just been on a visit to this country, Sir John Kotlawala.
There are times we have disagreed with you and even disliked your views and your policies, but we have all esteemed you highly.
This programme was going to start at 8. Around about 20 to 8, the old chap, quite suddenly, with Clemmy, his wife, came in. And I was shocked. I had no idea that he would look so old. I mean, he looked primeval. And his skin was like parchment, and leathery. and he was very, very slow. And all the children, people said, hello, Daddy, and all this kind of thing. He paid no attention to any of them, but shuffled across to one of the two chairs and sat down, and he'd hardly say in the wrong one, but there was no question of getting him up once he was down, planked himself down there, and Clemmy planked herself next to him. And the television set was on, and the news was on, and he looked at this thing. And he said in an extremely frail, broken voice, he said, is this a program? And Clemmy said, no, Winston, this is the news. I then said, and I saw from what Clemmy had done, that I had to address him in a kind of reverential bellow. So I said, no, sir, this is the preceding program, and at 8 o'clock they will be talking to you from Shepherd's Bush, Lord Ismay, and a group of friends will be talking to you here, sir. And he said, Ismay is in Paris. And I said, no, sir, we have brought him over to Shepherd's Bush.
Prime Minister, there are still an awful lot of people who want to greet you, and there's just time for a few friends to drink your health.
In all sincerity and affection, Sir Winston, I wish you very many happy returns of the day.
And, sir, there is B.C. Colburn, who has looked after us for a long time and is still looking after us.
Your very good health, sir.
When it's all finished, sir, I said, if you want to say anything back to them, you'll be able to do so. All you have to do, I'll give you a signal when they're finished, and it's just a question of turning to the camera, sir. And you can then talk to them. If you talk to the camera, they'll be able to see you. And he paid no attention, none. So I had no idea. So I nipped off, and the program by then was on the verge of starting. I rang Grace up. She was in the control gallery. Of course, it was live. Everything was live in those days. But it had to be live anyway. And she was in the control gallery in Lime Grove. And I rang her, and I said, I've no idea whether you're going to talk or not. And she was, no idea. She said, he must talk. And I said, well, I can't. He may, but I can't tell. She was very, very cross. I said, well, cross or no, you better have the trumpet. We'd got trumpets, of course, all laid on, flags and everything to finish the thing up with. And I said, we better have them laid on for a quick cue.
During the programme, Grace Wyndham Goldie in the control room at Lime Grove could see the old man, as she put it, staring blankly at his TV set without any visible response. She began to lose heart until the tribute from the daughter of the First World War Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith.
Very dear Winston, only a minute or two in which to try and tell you all I feel today.
It was a lovely programme, and Violet Bonham Carter was marvellous.
We have agreed and disagreed, argued and laughed and fought and hoped, but never feared. Because with you, no one could be afraid of anything. Courage. That is your greatest gift to those who know you.
At that moment, Goldie saw Churchill react at last. The ancient head, she said, moved slowly from side to side, and tears rolled down the leathery cheeks. Only we in the gallery saw this incredibly moving spectacle and could breathe a sigh of relief.
Good health, sir.
Prime Minister, happy days.
Happy days.
I knew the moment had come for me to try and give him a signal, and it was exactly as if I had come round a little bend in a little country road and run into a lorry with headlights on because he was glaring at me. And so I nervously made this signal, and it was just as if he was switched on. Life was in the old thing. And out came this enormous voice, no longer broken or fragile. I have been surprised and astounded and all this stuff.
I have been entranced by the thrilling panorama you have presented to me of so many of my most cherished friends who have been given an opportunity of expressing their feelings of kindness to me and the memories that they have I'm fortunate indeed to have met these men and women and to have worked with them in the years of struggle through which we have passed.
These huge Gibbonesque paragraphs came out of him, and they were first-rate, beautifully composed, properly finished, manly, and meaningful.
I'm grateful that modern science has enabled me, upon my birthday, to receive in this amazing manner their friendly greetings and good wishes. Good night.
Night.
And I thought, this is, wonderful. I waited until the credits were beginning to run, and then I rushed up to him, of course, to say that was magnificent, but he'd switched off. And his family came up. Daddy, but he paid no attention to them. None at all. He said in his broken-off voice to Clemmy, he said, I hadn't had time to prepare. And she said, you were very good, Winston. And he shuffled off like an old tortoise, shuffled off to the door, and then just before opening it, he looked round, as it were, switched on once more, didn't look at me, but looked at his family and said, I'm going to have a bath.
Grace managed to get him to talk, and it was his only ever television appearance, really.
That's quite something.
Oh, it was quite a coup. Live.